Hey, Ginger, how are you?
Well, I am so thankful to have you because I just watched this I guess that you call it a documentary of Billy Graham, and I think An Extraordinary Journey was really the perfect title. And he would have just turned 100, and my grandmother was born in the same year, and she would have turned 100 too this year. What an extraordinary thing to be just shy of 100 years on this earth, right?
That's right. Mr. Franklin would always say that, well, he said this when President Trump called him when Mr. Graham died and said, your dad almost made it to 100. Franklin said, well, if you go to the day he died, which was February 21st, and counted back 9 months, he would have been 100
When he died.
when he died, counting his time in the womb, because birth is at conception. So none of us want to add that extra 9 months as we get older, but he did in this case.
Well, that does make it a little bit more unique. This was an incredible. I grew up. Well, I was born almost 50 years ago. So my mom was. I was raised in the South in Texas, and my mom was a believer, and so I was raised around him and his crusades, and I remember just thinking as a young person, why is he yelling? you know, you know how it is when you're
Oh
young and
yeah,
you just don't understand what it is. And now that I'm this age, I'm like, why is no one yelling? And when you're younger, you don't understand that it was his passion. I think a lot of people try to emulate that same type of, expression with their preaching, but that only happens if you're passionate. It's only effective when you're passionate. You can yell, I mean, but it doesn't have that same experience. Can I ask you what your experience, how you became part of Billy Graham's association?
sure. Well, I'm a little different than yours. I'm a Jew, and I grew up in New York City. But
Wow.
interestingly, my dad used to love to watch Billy Graham on television on Saturdays when we'd come home from synagogue. My dad would turn on our little 13-inch black and white TV and watch Billy Graham. He watched Billy Graham and Oral Roberts, but he loved Billy Graham, and I would be wanting to go out and play with my friends because I didn't have time earlier in the day. So he'd say, "No, you've got to watch this man. He's a great man." So that's how I learned about Billy Graham. And then later in my life, I went through a rough patch as a youngster, and then uh, wound up working at the White House for the Reagans and met Mr. Graham a couple of times there. But that wasn't the reason that I got here. A friend of mine during my time as senior vice president of McDonald's Corporation, I went from from Ronald Reagan to Ronald McDonald, and I was also president of Ronald McDonald House Charities. I was there for 20 years, and during that time, I met a man who was owned one McDonald's restaurant, and he started to witness to me about Jesus. I said, "I'm a Jew. Listen, I don't need to hear all that." And
Oh,
he kept witnessing me for 10 years, and then
wow.
I in a time after going through a lot of trouble, but yet being very successful, I would say in my career, I wound up accepting Christ one night at a dinner table with him and my wife of 3 months. And I said to him, I took the risk of hurting my new bride's feelings. I just can't seem to get rid of this emptiness I have inside. And I'd had that since I was a little kid. And then he said, well, I've been telling you what you need to do for 10 years. So I said, well, how do we do that? Do I need to build a chuppah or step on a glass or go to a synagogue and announce my faith? He said, no, just pray with me. So we prayed right there at the table. And so I accepted Christ. Uh, Not coincidentally, but only in God's plan, did he happen to be on the board of the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association in Samaritan's Purse. And when I retired from McDonald's, 5 years after making that decision to accept Christ, he called me and said, "I know you're thinking about leaving McDonald's. Why don't you pray about coming down to North Carolina and working with Franklin Graham?" And I said, "You're out of your mind." He said, "Why?" I said, "Because there are a bunch of Christians down there." And I was just a new believer.
Right.
I can't do that. But the Lord had a different plan, and I came down to North Carolina and met Franklin, who has become one of my closest friends now over these 12 years I've been here. And that's how it started, but it's been a blessing ever since. I certainly got to be around Mr. Graham quite a bit in the early time I was here, and got to know him and Cliff Barrows and George Beverly Shea. And so learning the history was tremendous, and then being part of many, many events. And now with Franklin, of course, I travel with him, and I go to all of his festivals and get to listen to him talk about his dad. It's just been a blessing to see this film come out that really captures the life and the extraordinary journey of Mr. Graham. And some of the things that he did, and the way that he connected with not only my father and your family, but he's connected with millions and millions of people around the world. And that's just been an absolute blessing.
And I think what's really incredible is it was an extraordinary journey, but it started very simple and it ended very simple, didn't it? Like it was it was all about like this simplistic nature of who he was and who his God was, as far as it wasn't some, like you were saying about how you were to pray, it wasn't anything about him. It's easy to understand. It's not easy to comprehend God, but it's easy to understand, the simplistic nature of the gospel, as far as how we can, in our own finite minds, we can, understand the process of who he was. And I mean, I thought that was so, impactful, watching, thousands of people around him at this funeral with him in a pine box. I mean, that's, my mom has said from early on in my young years, she has said, she's like, bury me in a pine box, do not waste money on a coffin, I am not going to care. And she's like, just, I don't want anything fancy. If you guys want to get together and comfort each other, but don't comfort yourselves, don't cry for me. And I think it was something so simple, the way he made it understandable. I think that's why he affected so many people. Whenever I would see him, I don't know, there was this, he reminded my grandfather, like he had this kindness in his eyes, and his smile could just comfort or something. It was just something that, it was God shining through him. He wasn't, didn't lead this like extravagant life or anything like that. It was such a, it was simple to him. It was clear and cut. This is my God. This is who I serve. And in times where things weren't simple at all, during segregation, or watching that, was, I just cried through most of this entire documentary, because yeah, I don't remember what it was like to have segregation. I had friends of all colors, but my mom remembers it. And just watching the impact that he had from president to president, um, and it's so fantastic to hear, his kids talk about not only him but his amazing mother. Um, because behind any good man of God is an incredible godly woman, and it has to be to raise the kids, and especially when he's gone for so long. And does anyone talk about, like, her, did she have fear when he would go to places like Russia and places where there was great unrest, that even in the South?
She's a very, very special woman, and she understood that this was the calling of God upon him. And she was born in China, and was raised there in a difficult time and understood what it was like. They had to leave China because of the some of the persecution that was going on there at the time. So she wasn't a stranger to those kinds of things or those kinds of thoughts. And having 5 children, Mr. Graham said, and said many times, that he had to leave with tears in his eyes from such a loving wife and raising children who all turned out to be great kids. And he really does thank her for being the most wonderful Christian he's ever known. So he gave tons of credit to Mrs. Graham, and certainly she supported him through all these times and raised those kids. And having a son like Franklin probably wasn't easy when he was young, but he turned out to be a great evangelist too in his own right. So they had a great life together, and it comes through the sincerity and the compassion and the love that he had, not only for his family, but for everyone. And I've always said in my life, the 3 most humble human beings I've ever met were certainly Mr. Graham, George Beverly Shea, and Cliff Barrows. And the 3 of them together, crisscrossed the world, leading people to Christ. And of course, Cliff was the MC, and George Beverly Shea sang with this huge baritone voice.
It was beautiful.
And of course, Mr. Graham preached behind them, so they had a great trio. But it was Mr. Graham that was the gel and for everybody. So you have to think, what was it like to preach in front of 1 million people? I mean, to get up there, and I think he probably had butterflies every time he got up to speak, but it never seemed that way. And he always could relate to people, no matter who it was, whether it was a prisoner in jail, in prison, or it was a person, a soldier in Vietnam or Korea, or it was another pastor or a young child. He always could relate to them. And that was what made him very special. God gave him such great gifts that he could communicate with everyone.
You think about, well, there was Oral Roberts and there was other people, doing crusades and things like that. Why? I mean, and I know Billy Graham in the documentary said, like, I think his first sermon was to like 35 people. What do you think was, I mean, there's a lot of great men of God. What do you think, propelled him so fast, so quick to be thousands of people attending in front of him?
Well, I can tell you what the story is, and I think what happened was he was in Los Angeles and built the campus cathedral and a tent out there in Los Angeles, right in downtown Los Angeles, and it was going slow for a couple of days, and all of a sudden, William Randolph Hearst, the publisher of all the big newspapers, sent a telegraph to the reporters saying 2 words: Puff Graham, Puff Graham. And we still have that telegraph here that we got from one of the reporters, and that was really what made the world attention through the media. And Mr. Graham was a master of the media. The mission statement of the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association is to share the gospel in every corner of the earth using every available means. And Mr. Graham used every available means from the early newspapers to early television, but radio was the main way that he communicated. And that just, got people.
I think there was something just so, beautiful about what happened, the calm that would come over people. And then when you would see, you'd think all these thousands of people, and then the hundreds that would come to the altar, in any other setting, that would cause injury, it would cause unrest of some kind. But you know what I mean? That many people coming.
And you asked about the other people who were preaching at the time. All of them had a great respect for Mr. Graham right from the beginning. There wasn't, back in those days, wasn't a sense of competition.
Right.
The world was let's reach as many people as we possibly can with the message of Christ. Today, I would say it's probably a little bit different with the internet and social media that people get into these. Let's see how many people we can reach or what kind of audience we can get. And if I've got a bigger audience than you, then I'm more successful than you. That wasn't the case with Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham said there was plenty of room for everybody, and I think some of those, they were all good friends, Oral Roberts and Mr. Graham, and the people that all preached the gospel didn't have a competition between them. They knew that this was God's work, and God protected Mr. Graham and the people around him very, very well. We had a thing called the Modesto Manifesto, which was to 4 points of ethics, I would say. Never to be alone with a woman unless it was your wife.
Right.
Never to, always to be honest in your financial dealings, always to be transparent in all of the numbers that you produced, and making sure that you honored each other. You honored another Christian worker. You never spoke badly of another Christian worker. And our society's become pretty divided. But Mr. Graham never would do that, and Franklin doesn't do that at all. Franklin maintains that same ethics that his father did, and Will, who's the grandson, will continue to do that. It's just part of the DNA of this organization and what Mr. Graham instilled in everybody. But he was just a magnetic personality, and preached a simple message, as you said, from his heart, and that heart was given him by God.
And it was quite, I'm from Texas, and I had grandparents that faced great scrutiny they had a general store, and they had faced great scrutiny for making, transactions with, people of color, and, like if they didn't have enough money for groceries, my grandfather would trade, groceries for produce, like when their harvest came in. And, he was, even though it was a kind area, still people were unkind about it. And me, I never understood it, because by the time I had young friends, it was very much, disintegrated, a lot of that at least. And I think, wow, what it would be incredible. Like, I don't know if it would have the same impact, and yet, what if it had a bigger impact if Billy Graham were to start in the age of social media? I think some of the magic, of course, was the fact that people were present in person, and to see those crowds of people coming together. And I wish I could have been there when he took the ropes down at that, the conference, or whatever you would call it, where a crusade, when he came to speak, and the usher would literally not remove the ropes between the black people and the white people, and then he literally came down and did it himself. I mean,
that's right. And the usher quit. He walked out because Mr. Graham said he wouldn't preach to a segregated audience, and he did that. It's interesting. And Mr. Graham has said, he probably the people that he was preaching to, that he knew were probably members of the Ku Klux Klan sitting in the front row. But he took on some huge social issues. That, communism during the Cold War, and, being a counselor to presidents. Of course, presidents were popular and unpopular back then. The president didn't just start that. But Mr. Graham didn't take sides in anything. Mr. Graham, he took sides in what was wrong, what was ungodly, but he didn't take sides in politics. And if he did, he said he wished he hadn't. But it wasn't a question of whether Mr. Graham was on the right or left. He was on God's side, and that's what comes through in this video. And I think everybody would see it. And it was his era, and all through his life was a time of healing and a time of repentance and salvation. And that's what he preached, very simply. And I know I moved to Texas in 1971, and I thought, cows came, chickens came in packages from New York City. And I found that different in Texas, and I love the state of Texas. So we've been back there several times since, and more people, I think, in Texas remember Mr. Graham than any other state, although people always do. We've got one of our strongest bases in Texas. So God bless you for being there, and I'm certainly glad your parents did what they did, because that shows a real heart. And I think that Mr. Graham was that heart for a lot of people.
I think at all these different times, like after Martin Luther King was killed and after 9/11, and from president to president, and all these times where there was great unrest, he could just bring this peaceful atmosphere at these crucial times that really needed to hear the comfort of God and have he was a conduit. He was basically like a funnel. It just, he took it in and filled himself up, and then it just continually flowed out of him, and it was such an incredible thing to watch. And I know that I will be able to tell my grandchildren how blessed I was to have been around when he was, when his ministry was up and coming. And so now the DVD is for sale for this incredible program.
Here's the DVD is available for purchase, certainly, if you go to our website at bgea.org or to billygrahambookstore.org. People can order that, and it's a wonderful, wonderful DVD, as you know. And what you were saying was that how you lived during his lifetime and your parents, but that it's February 21st, for the 10 days following that, was a time in this country of great peace. And his funeral, as you'll remember, that was aired around the world, all the fighting stopped. All the political fighting stopped. All the hatred seemed to stop for those 10 days while we were going through the process of his funeral. And I will tell you, the planning for that funeral had been going on for several years. Yet, when it happened, Franklin called me, and all of our people here that had been planning just went into motion with all the plans we had. And that entire time, even with the president saying he wanted to come and the vice president and taking Mr. Graham to Washington, that was all without a flaw. I can tell you from the inside, there was not a flaw in that funeral or any of the preparations or the outcome. It was wonderful. And
and it rarely happens it rarely happens that it's seamless in a small funeral, much less one of that magnitude. I mean,
it was just terrific. And people here, it was free. The only thing I would say was it was freezing here that day, freezing in North Carolina, and we had an open tent, and that was intentional. But we still, I think we would have put the sides down if we had known it was going to be but it was a blessing. Nobody complained. We got people blankets and warm as we could. But the people hung around for a long time afterwards, and they were there for a few hours before because of the president coming. But it was a beautiful service, and that's on the DVD too, so people can get a chance to see that and some of the extra special things we put on afterwards. Attached to that special are all on the DVD also, so people can get to watch that. So I really hope people will get it and watch it and share it with their kids and their grandkids, because to our knowledge, there never will be another Billy Graham, but you don't know what God's got in store. But right now, we had this one, and we were so happy to have him and cherish the time that he was alive. And even in his death, he's always going to be remembered.
And it was, I will say too, not only is it a incredible, depiction of his life, but it was incredibly edited and produced. The way that the interviews, went right into hearing his voice preaching, and then different, visual things in between. It was so powerful. And, on my counter when I was watching it, watching the screener, it was 100 minutes, and I thought how incredible is 100 minutes of 100 years, you know.
That's a great thing. I'm glad you said that, Ginger, because I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah.
But that was all produced, every bit of it, other than the newsreel stuff that might be in there. But
Right.
every bit of that, and the editing was all done right here by our staff at the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association. Every bit of it. All those interviews of people were done by our team, and it's been worked on for, of course, many years. But right down to the end, and of course, the major editor of that was Franklin himself. Franklin had a lot to do with that, with the whole DVD. And even when we were right at the final edits of it, he wanted to see it again and again, and added some things and changed some things, all to the good. And really was very actively involved in the whole production. So we were just thrilled with the way it turned out, and I think most people will be. And I don't see how you could be disappointed in this DVD.
No, even if you're watching it as a historian, you know, just to watch the events that took place during his 100 years, I mean, that alone will make you interested in the entire thing. And of course, then the spiritual component just takes it out of this universe. It's so amazing. And I can imagine Franklin as not only part of the ministry, but that being his father, wanting it to be a very well done project to honor him. And he did. It was a fantastic program, and I urge everyone to take a look at it. You can order it at bgea.org, correct?
That's correct, or BillyGrahamBookstore.org. Either one of those. And we'll make sure people get it as quickly as they order it. We'll get it to them.
Well, I appreciate you. You have no idea how thrilled I was to do the interview, and I was so thrilled to watch this and experience it. And it was an honor to watch this documentary. And I definitely urge anybody of any background, whoever you are, you will be touched. There's no way you can't be to witness this life. It was an extraordinary one to watch, you know, in person, but it still is extraordinary, or maybe more so now, you know, just being able to look back on his entire life. There's so many things. I guess I felt like I knew so many things about Billy Graham, and then there was things that I just didn't realize, you know, the impact that he had, and I know he will continue to have through his ministry. It's fantastic, and I can't imagine the reception he got. I think those crowds that we see in that DVD has nothing to do with the crowds that he encountered when he came into heaven, as all those people that said, I'm here because I attended something, I heard your sermon. You know, I can't even imagine. It must have been quite the homecoming.
Well, I'm sure it was, and he always said he was going to ask God why he picked him when he got there. I'm sure that it was made clear as soon as he stepped into heaven with God and Jesus and with Mrs. Graham and anybody else who preceded him. And I just pray for all of your audience and everybody that they too will come to know Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior and have that same experience when they get to meet Billy Graham in heaven.
And how fitting was it for Franklin to give an invitation? I thought that was beautiful.
He never misses an opportunity, and he's right now in Erbil, Iraq. He was here yesterday signing books, celebrating his father's 100th birthday, and he landed this morning at 10 o'clock in Erbil, Iraq. So he's sharing the gospel with people in Iraq and in Kurdistan. So pray for him.
I absolutely will. Thank you so much again.
Thank you, Ginger.
We appreciate you.